Dungeons & Dragons has spoiled casters over the last 20 to 25 years, and the designers of Pathfinder 2e thought that they needed a nerf, and the majority of Pathfinder 2e players agree with them. However, there's been discussion lately about whether they went too far. Today, I go through the evolution of casters in D&D, but it's only one of the things I cover today. I'm covering the state of casters in Pathfinder 2e. Now, I confess that this video is a bit more meandering than my usual Rules Lawyer video, which can be pretty meandering, but I thought it was necessary for this video because there's a variety of strong opinions on this issue, with a lot of people talking past each other, and I thought it was important for there to be one video that addressed a lot of viewpoints at once. If any part offends, please watch the whole video because I probably acknowledge your point of view somewhere. There has been a rebellion of players of casters in Pathfinder 2e forums. People who are dissatisfied with the state of casters in the game, saying either that they're too weak or that they're not fun to play. On the one hand, I think there needs to be some more awareness of how awesome casters can be in the system. As evidence, I play a clip from my Fist of the Ruby Phoenix campaign where everyone in the group plays martial characters, except for one who plays a bard, and when that player was absent that day, his character was piloted by the person in the upper right corner. Okay, no save, it's gone, right?
What? Oh, I thought there was
save.
Yeah, it takes checks to get out of the maze. This is one nod to the past.
Right. That's why it's so strong. Holy cow! Yeah, conspiratorial is out. I'm just.
Whoa. Is this what it's like to be a spellcaster?
On the other hand, due to recent events, the long simmering frustration that many players have felt with casters has now bubbled to the surface. This frustration is sincere, and it has led to a sometimes rancorous, but in the end, a healthy discussion on the state of casters in the system. We are facing a reckoning of where casters are at and where they should be both in this edition and the next edition of Pathfinder. I'm Ronald, the Rules Lawyer. This is the latest in what I'm calling my caster series, where first I talked about how I do not think Paizo is trying to nerf casters this year further. I defend the decision to remove the traditional 8 magical schools from D&D. I defend people who raise frustrations about casters from people who tell them to get good and who are gatekeeping assholes. This video talking about why casters need to feel weak to some players in Pathfinder. My long-awaited video that's part of my law school series on how to caster good in Pathfinder. And a new video I'm planning on how to buff casters in your Pathfinder game if your table chooses to do so. If you want to see those videos, you will get early access on my Patreon if you support it, as well as access to exclusive videos, including the exclusive vid where I talk to veteran Pathfinder 2e players from my Discord and brainstorm ideas on how to caster good. So let's have an overview of the problem and talk about how casters were nerfed in Pathfinder 2e. There is a consensus, I would say, among Pathfinder 2e players that the designers did the right thing in nerfing casters because of people's dissatisfaction with casters in both D&D 5th edition and Pathfinder 1st edition / D&D 3rd edition. Those are games in which everyone pretty much agrees that casters can dominate, especially at the mid to higher levels. It affects the balance of the game, and you can have unsatisfying and anticlimactic combat that might devolve into who wins initiative, or rocket tag. Make sure the wizard wins initiative. So yes, nearly all Pathfinder 2e players, I would say, agree that this nerf was needed, and the same can't be said about D&D players. I'm just going to show a couple of comments that did not get much support on Reddit, saying that it wasn't enough simply to buff marshals, but that casters needed to be nerfed to bring them closer. Which gets my later point about caster players in general in the tabletop role-playing game space. Still, Pathfinder 2e players who agree that there needed to be a nerf are unsatisfied with play as a caster, saying either that they've been over-nerfed or that they're not enjoyable to play. I tested the over-nerfed theory in a video early in the life of my channel, which reported on an experiment in my Discord server where we had a team of only marshals and a team of only casters go through the same gauntlet of dungeon rooms and then fight each other in the end. The casters won, by the way, but not because I think they were stronger. The answer is in the video, which there's a link in the description. In that video, I went more in detail about how Pathfinder 2e weakened casters. I'll quickly summarize it here. They made a lot of spells weaker. Save or select spells do exist, however, they're usually hidden behind the monster having to critically fail on their saving throw. And for spells that shut down an enemy that have the incapacitation trait, high-level creatures get to treat their saving throw as 1 degree of success better, which makes it impossible to turn that dragon to stone. Single target damage is lower than in previous editions. Also, your spells almost always cost 2 or more actions, and spells rely on a limited resource, your spell slots. Particularly for prepared spellcasters who have 1 casting of Disintegrate for that day, for it to miss the creature feels kind of bad, whereas the fighter can swing all day. Well, I for one think that casters are where they need to be at in the system, currently. This is how I'll get there in this video. First, I need to cover the reality that players' expectations have risen because of D&D, and I'm talking about players in the overall TTRPG space, because many of the players who play PF2 now happily are recent migrants from other editions. Then I talk about how it is that casters are kind of awesome and what their niche is in the party. And then I get to why I think casters need to feel quote-unquote weaker in Pathfinder 2e. Some of what I'm about to say, I think the discussions on the subreddit that I follow closely already have kind of accepted. And so I'm not only spouting my own personal rules lawyer opinions, but also conveying what a lot of people are coming to realize or learn now. So, the raised expectations by D&D. I originally planned to make a video like this before the current brouhaha around casters about how some players of casters need to just accept that that other class can do something better than you. That planned video was the result of discussions and comments I was receiving when I started to post my video coverage of the new Kineticist class. I called it the blaster caster that Pathfinder seems to have successfully achieved. Now, it is not a caster as I would define it in this video, which would be a character that has access to a full spell list. Rather, what Kineticists are is somewhat of a hybrid between martials and casters. On the one hand, they can do 1-action elemental blasts, and on the other hand, they have abilities that resemble spells, but they simply need to summon their elemental aura or build it up in order to cast them. And there's no daily limit on how often they can do it. I also pointed out in my coverage that their blasts are not as damaging as a martial character's strikes, weapon strikes, and that their spells, quote unquote, are not quite as powerful as a spellcaster's highest level spell slots. I was saying that the Kineticist's niche was that they combined consistency and versatility in a single class, while still leaving martial characters their role and casters their role. There were a lot of favorable comments that I received for the videos, but I also got comments like the following. This one reads, "Here's the problem. I want to be a blaster wizard, not be relegated to having to play Kineticist or Psychic. And the Psychic is a spellcasting class that has stronger cantrips, but fewer spell slots per day." The comment goes on, PF2, quote, "Play anything you want, except don't be a wizard and want to do damage, or be a witch that's actually useful," end quote. The counter-argument here is kind of obvious. As a wizard, you have something that the Kineticist does not have. You have access to hundreds of spells in the arcane spell list, and compared to the Psychic, you have effectively 4 spell slots per level as opposed to 2. Therefore, letting a wizard be just as good a blaster as, say, the Kineticist or the Psychic would beg the question, why ever be a Kineticist or Psychic if you can just be the wizard and not lose anything? This is the argument that often crops up online, and someone on my Discord summarized it, "I want to be really good at X. Here's a class that's the best at X. No, I don't want to be that class. I want to do it as this other class." And in online TTRPG discussions generally, that other class is almost always a spellcaster, and often it's a wizard. And I'll say this, in a class-based system, every class needs something that they're the best at. Not equally as good at another class at, but best. Because why have that class at all otherwise? No one else can outdo them on it. It would be ridiculous for a fighter to complain about not being able to cast Fireball. We have a state in the hobby where that sounds patently ridiculous, but the reverse does not. We have a situation where D&D has spoiled spellcasters, and Pathfinder 1st Edition was guilty of perpetuating this, although by necessity, because part of what they had to do was allow people to still play the D&D they loved, 3rd Edition. Forever, marshals in D&D and Pathfinder 1st Edition had gotten used to casters in their party winning kind of single-handedly, being able to alter reality and do a whole variety of things, including lots of damage, controlling enemies, buffing allies, be able to pivot to do different things, area of effect attacks, be durable and hard to hit, heal allies, have utility outside of combat as well as in, cast silvery barbs, debuffing. We've gotten to a point where casters are just not used to another class doing something just as well as they can. And when someone outshines them on something, say doing damage and killing things, some players of casters are kind of like that straight A student who the teacher already loves and appreciates, but when someone else gets the spotlight, they kind of jump in front of them and say, well, I need to do that too. And it always hasn't been this way, at least not to this extent, in the history of D&D. Here's a picture from the 1st edition Player's Handbook. A lot of the spells that people would recognize are the most powerful and broken in 5th edition have their roots in the early editions. However, there were things that countered that for spellcasters. The magic user had very few hit points, 1 to 4 hit points per level, in fact. Could not wear armor. Also, I looked at the artwork from the Player's Handbook, and you saw hardly any of the imagery we are used to seeing today of being kind of a badass who could manipulate the threads of reality. Rather, you were kind of, and I say this as a person who grew up as a nerd who could unlock the gates of power, but only through intense study. And you had to find those spell scrolls too. You started with 1 to 4 spells that the GM chose for you, and to get more spells, you had to find them through adventuring. And your spells were more of a toolbox. They weren't all ways to shut down and kill enemies. A lot of things that are now cantrips, that we expect them to be cantrips, were first level spells, like Message. Strong first level spells like Sleep existed, but you had to find those. You also had to earn more experience points than other classes to level up, at least in the earliest levels, when you were most vulnerable. You had the worst saving throws. Your saving throws advanced every 5 levels compared to the fighter, which was every 2 levels. And the way saving throws worked, the higher level the creature, the more they resisted magic. So as you leveled up and got to 6th, 7th, 8th level spells, monsters tended to resist you more often. So higher level monsters resisted magic. They also had spell resistance. Some creatures had 90% spell resistance or 100% spell resistance. You also needed lots of time to prepare your spells every morning. If you're a high level caster, it might take more than 24 hours to get all your spells prepared. You couldn't spam your spells every day. Also, you had to declare your spells at the start of a round that you were casting. If you received a single point of damage, your spell was interrupted, no saving throw. With D&D 3rd edition, we got the modern initiative system where everybody rolls initiative and goes in turn order. And since then, spellcasters have been able to resolve their spell the moment they cast it. They also removed the problem of spells being harder to land against higher level monsters by scaling your DCs with your level. And in 3rd edition, it was possible to stack up those bonuses so that you were nearly impossible to resist. 3rd edition also brought multi-classing where you can take a level from another class, which introduced the phenomenon of spellcasters being able to take a level in fighter and grabbing a bunch of what used to be exclusive to martial characters in a single level. Level dipping is the term. The niche protection allowing fighters to have something other classes could not was removed. Feats also had a similar effect. Your cleric could take a feat in heavy armor proficiency. 3rd edition is also when the term Godzilla was coined, referring to the fact that you could build a cleric or druid who could do what a cleric or druid can do, plus be a better fighter than the fighter. 5th edition D&D, of course, wanted to address these imbalances, and so they nerfed a number of spells, and they also introduced the concentration mechanic so that you can only have one particularly powerful spell at a time. But it also introduced new issues. Flexible spellcasting, the ability to decide at the moment you spend your spell slot which of your spells you are casting, has led to a situation where a lot of powerful low-level spells like Shield, Silvery Barbs, and when you become a mid or high-level caster, things like Hypnotic Pattern, Web, you can spam these at will. You can cast Hypnotic Pattern 2 times with the assurance that you can cast 7 more times today. Same thing with Shield and Silvery Barbs. And something new happens in 5th edition that I haven't seen really recognized. In previous editions, you could cast those powerful spells, but you were done for the day. But in 5e, you can still fall back onto very powerful cantrips. Eldritch Blast is very powerful, lets you do 1d10 force damage, and at level 2, if you're like most Warlock players and take Agonizing Blast, you can add your Charisma mod to that. You're now doing damage equal to what many warriors are doing at the safety of range. Firebolt is also a very powerful cantrip. Meanwhile, your caster has those spell slots when you want to do even more damage, whereas the marshals need to spend their precious feats on trying to keep up. And that's if the DM allows feats. You basically outdamage the marshals without using any of your daily resources. Unless you have a marshal who's taking a couple of must-pick feats, you can outclass the marshal characters in consistent damage. Also, the basic way to counter a spellcaster from previous editions, get in their face and hit them, got harder. A spellcaster was now able to cast a spell while a fighter was bearing down on them, unless they have a specific feat that may not be allowed in the game. And with the shield cantrip, that caster, especially if they have many spell slots, which they do by 5th level, will have a higher armor class than many marshals. And many casters have Misty Step and can just get away. In Pathfinder 2e, cantrips got a significant buff compared to the editions it evolves from. In 1st edition Pathfinder and 3e, a cantrip did 1 to 3 damage. But the design decision was made for Pathfinder cantrips to not meet marshals in doing consistent single target damage, and to give casters a variety of cantrips that each have their own niche. This expectation that 5e raised that cantrips should do consistent damage on par with marshals is behind some of the upset about the change to cantrip damage, which I thought was an overreaction, which I addressed in one of my previous videos. This tour that we've gone through on recent editions of D&D, I hope proves that caster players have been kind of spoiled the last 20 to 25 years. And the truism applies that when one is accustomed to privilege for a long time, equality can feel like oppression. Now, I don't mean that to be a blanket statement. Not everybody who's complaining about the current state of casters in Pathfinder 2e wants to be better at everybody at everything. But if you're coming into Pathfinder 2e expecting or wanting casters to do what another class does, let's say single target consistent damage, while still retaining all the other advantages of a full spell list, then yes, I think the expectation that casters can do all these things is at play. So here's another comment to my Kineticist video. The Blaster caster player is always wanted. Does less damage than a fighter, lol. So here's someone wanting the Kineticist to do the same damage as a fighter. So this phenomenon is not confined to just wizard players, but to any other class that goes beyond the mundane, that has a claim to what many of us would recognize as magic. There's just this expectation that magical characters should surpass the poor mundane marshals. The fighter is not able to heal with water or create fireballs at will, but this commenter, wants to be able to do those things, plus do what the fighter does just as well as the fighter. Basically fight better than the fighter, when that's ridiculous. So this idea of niche protection, that every class should have their thing that they're best at, is not just me talking. I think that this sentiment is now being recognized over at the subreddit, as shown by this exchange. You can pause it if you want to read it. So what is it that casters can do that is awesome in Pathfinder 2e? Well, I've already referred to the full spell list. Someone on my Discord called casters Magic Swiss Army Knives. Marshals are the kings or queens of consistent single target damage. Hit, hit, hit. But as a caster, there's a whole variety of things you can do, not just in combat, but outside combat. You can heal, make the party able to travel, divine whether people are lying, create illusions, affect people's minds, make the dead speak, create pocket planes. I could go on and on. You also have utility inside combat. There's a variety of things you can do that are not just damage that martial characters struggle to match you in the variety. You can control enemies, deny them actions, deny them movement. You can buff your allies, grant them more actions, make them more accurate. You can debuff enemies, make that boss easier to hit. You can heal allies or shield them from damage. And you can do damage, especially damage against multiple targets at once that martial characters generally cannot do. You have the benefit of versatility. You can choose what damage type you want to do. There are many monsters in Pathfinder 2e who have damage weaknesses. And because you have a variety of ways to attack a creature, you can target different defenses. Marshals who want to do damage have to target an enemy's armor class, whereas you, if you plan ahead, can target any of a creature's defenses, including their saving throws. The fact that you can choose what defense to target, which can be several points lower, mitigates the fact that casters have lower accuracy than marshals at most levels. And your versatility alone, as I often like to repeat, is its own measure of power. Sometimes there will be an enemy that has resistance to physical damage, or who's just going to win because they're higher level, a head-to-head exchange of swings, unless you do something to tilt the entire battle, which many spells can do. Spells in certain situations can have an oversized impact. One obvious case is putting a wall of stone to cut the enemy's forces in half, or a spell that does persistent damage that triggers an enemy's weakness every turn. Your power is having the right tool for the job. Not everything you face can be solved by damage per round, and thank goodness for that. A lot of what makes Pathfinder combat more interesting and tactical is that it's not simply a war of the spreadsheets of different DPR formulas. There's a video I recommend, I'll have a link in the description, that talks about the importance of conditions in tactical games. The whole variety of things that are not just DPR, buffing, debuffing, action denial, splitting the enemy and preventing them from having their synergies. Everything you can think of in the division of labor within the party in what is a team game, the casters get to do those things. Pathfinder generally is a team game and is a class-based game where every class can do certain things well. And whereas the marshals can do their thing well, you have a variety of things that you can do well. So let's look at that clip we saw earlier. The maze spell is one of those spells in Pathfinder 2e that doesn't allow a saving throw. They can then spend an action to try to get out of the maze, and it takes 2 successes to get out, 1 if it's a critical success, but they can only make 1 check per turn. At level or high level foes might lose a whole round plus an action. Those much higher level boss monsters you target might be back with only 1 action. For some people not familiar with Pathfinder 2e, that does not sound very impressive for the cost of an 8th level spell slot. But that is kind of huge. You delete them from the battlefield, relieving your party members from any pressure a strong melee foe who had attack of opportunity, for example, had. And now the party can focus fire on somebody else and permanently remove them from the battlefield. There are many monsters who rely on doing 2 action activities or 3 action activities, or being able to move to aim one of those that you have prevented. So I'm going to play that moment again, but also play some of the discussion we had soon after that moment about the role of casters in Pathfinder 2e.
Is this what it's like to be a spellcaster?
Spellcasters are super weak in Pathfinder. They're like, as far as damage goes, but when it comes to like turning the tides of battle, they're amazing. They're super strong.
That was insane.
God, this is such a good spell.
If you're looking only for numbers and damage, yeah, it's a problem. But what Teru does is so game-changing. Each go-round, each time, it can't be compared.
Like every
and
battle.
that's what people don't connect to.
Like we can just do a catalog of the last 6 battles, I feel like, and just say how Teru is vital to each one.
MVP stuff.
Now I plan to have a live stream on this channel with those players about casters in Pathfinder. Like and subscribe and ring the bell if you want to get notified about it. In our Marshals v Casters experiment, the winner we declared was the dragon. The all-martial team lost against the dragon. The all-caster team also lost against the dragon. It was pretty much agreed that if there had been a balanced party, they would have defeated the dragon. When marshals and casters need each other in what's in the end a cooperative game, it doesn't, in my mind, make sense to think of one being stronger, quote-unquote, than the other. As I say in that video, the way that Pathfinder solved, quote unquote, the martial caster problem was to make it so that they need each other. I also have to comment on the fact that we kind of have a cultural bias saying that being a support player is somehow inferior. Not only are there many things a caster can do, they're not simply a support player, but I also want to challenge the idea that it's less fun or less glorious. First, I can't tell people to feel a certain way, but I would tell people to reconsider the fact that from the point of view of that monster who just got critically hit by that fighter because you buffed the fighter, they hate both of you equally. Both of you worked together to kick their ass. And also, if it helps, maybe think of those martial characters as your bodyguards while you stay in the back untouched while they do the dirty work. Or think of yourself as the puppet master who lets other people shine with your permission. Find a way to make the fantasy satisfying to you, while remembering that the fighter needs to have their fantasy too. Now let's compare what a lot of the discussions online have been focusing on, which is single target damage, comparing martials and casters. Now, these spells cost 2 actions versus a weapon strike of 1 action. True. However, I think one thing that's lost in the discussion is the fact that movement costs an action in Pathfinder 2e. A melee fighter often needs an action to move up to somebody, whereas a caster can do one of these cantrips from range. Now what about a ranger with a bow? Well, yes, they don't have to spend an action to fire their bow, but their damage is less than what a martial with a melee weapon is in Pathfinder 2e. Pathfinder has chosen to make ranged weapons do less damage than melee. When you are at range, you're able to, using a term from chess, fork and threaten the whole battlefield. That puts pressure on the whole battlefield and gives you more options. And also, you're not putting yourself directly in harm's way within the reach of those strong melee attacks from monsters. Now, if you want to be a blaster caster in Pathfinder 2e, someone who consistently does good single target damage, then I would recommend the Kineticist, given what options currently exist for classes in Pathfinder right now. You have the consistency of your blasts, which only cost a single action. They don't do as much damage as the fighter, but you also have the option of doing caster-like abilities without having to worry about conserving spell slots. However, I would not say that casters are hopeless when it comes to blasting, not at all. Your focus is going to be on area of effect spells and having rider effects on your damage, and you would need to be committing many of your spell slots from your highest ranks. And if you do this, your big blasts, let's call them, will be more impactful than anything a kineticist of similar level will do. Yes, you are limited to how many you can do, but it's the big fights that count, the big moments. But basically, as a full list spellcaster, you have to choose that morning what you're going to specialize in that day. And you have the freedom of having it be blasting or one of the many other things you can do. In D&D, since 3rd edition especially forward, caster players have been kind of used to being prepared for all occasions and to, at a moment's notice, be a blaster or to be the person scrying in a treasure vault. In 3rd edition, all of your spells, even the low-level ones, remained useful because they auto-heightened with your character level, and there are also some quite powerful low-level spells. And in 5th edition, the flexibility you have with your spell slots makes you have access to your entire prepared library so long as you have spell slots. Starting with Pathfinder 2, you need to kind of specialize in whatever it is that you want to focus. Now we get to why casters, I think, need to feel weaker, quote-unquote, in Pathfinder. I hope from what I've said so far that the answer is apparent, but first I'm going to start with this comment I found. They say, I just want a blaster caster. Big damage, bright lights. A blaster caster that, and I think they mean to say, has 0 utility. No summoning, no debuffing, bad mobility, bad health, bad armor, no shield block, no special magical solutions to problems. For all this, it does more damage than a fighter. Is that actually so imbalanced? So I think the answer to the question is in that comment, which is they want to give up special magical solutions to problems and all these other things that you kind of cannot separate from having access to a full spell list. The power of casters, their niche, is the spell list. They have the versatility of doing hundreds of different things and a virtual monopoly on many things that no other class can do. For prepared spellcasters, they can decide in the morning whether they're going to raise the dead today, teleport today, dispel magic, force people to tell the truth today, open magical locks today. Even spontaneous spellcasters, when played well, can have wands, staves, and scrolls to do these things. This is the answer to why casters must feel weaker in Pathfinder 2e. Their quote-unquote power is in their ability to do all of these things rather than doing a narrow set of things very well. And I understand that this answer is not satisfactory to many people who want to have a better experience playing casters. Again, who don't want casters to be more powerful than other classes, but want to do one or some of the things casters currently can do, but better. And the versatility of the class does make the class harder to play. It's just the nature of having so many choices. It's kind of axiomatic. And this is a legitimate complaint. Not everybody who's complaining about casters right now wants to outclass marshals, but want to be able to do a certain thing well. Don't necessarily want the full access to all of the options casters currently have. There is an excellent post from someone on Reddit from several months ago called "The Problem with PF2 Spellcasters is not power, it's barrier of entry." And I'll include a link to this post in the description. But they write, "Ultimately, I think the game is so focused on making sure a 900 IQ player with 20 years of TTRPG experience doesn't explode the game on a caster, a noble goal, and that for the most part they achieved, that it forgets to consider what the caster experience for the average player is like." However, I don't think it's fully accepted yet, and I hope this video can move the discussion forward, that access to a full spell list cannot be maintained while giving some players the kind of power that they're looking for in a more narrow area. So I made this post on the Reddit making the point, what does satisfactory lower skill floor for a caster look like for you? And I pointed out how many spells there are in the game. And that if they're looking to the kineticist as a model of what they're looking for in a blaster caster, I pointed out that the kineticist doesn't have the full spell list, and if you were to give blaster power to a caster, why would they ever want to be a kineticist? And it got downvoted, but the response did kind of acknowledge my point. But this higher skill floor for casters is a reality, and so I've been prepping for this upcoming video, giving practical advice to players who are having trouble playing spellcasters in the system, and also planning a video on how some tables who want to boost casters can do so at their tables. So, closing thoughts. Well, the big bad after all is the full spell lists, as I hope I've pointed out, and the fact that there are kind of iconic spells in D&D's tradition, and the whole variety of things that those spells can do, and the fact that they can do all of those things and no one else can. In a word, we're dealing with some sacred cows in D&D. In the case of removing alignment and removing the traditional D&D 8 magic schools, which Paizo will be doing with the remaster coming out this fall, it's apparent that Paizo kind of had wanted to do some of these changes, but did not make those changes in 2019 when they released Pathfinder 2e. Now with Wizards of the Coast eliminating security in the Open Gaming License, OGL, that's been the occasion for Paizo to remove these things in the remaster. Another sacred cow in 2019 was the Wizard class and the Cleric class, and the fact that we have these huge spell lists that can do a whole variety of things that people associate with the fantasy of Pathfinder, not just D&D, but first edition Pathfinder, of the world, the ability to raise the dead, to transmute rock to mud, to plane shift to other planes of existence. Removing these things would have changed the world itself. Similar thing about having to track daily spell slots and Vancian spellcasting, having a limited number of resources per day to track. If these were all removed in 2019, there may very well have been an accusation that Pathfinder was just 4E, which some people accuse it of anyway, but it would have been even more magnified. However, time is now passing. We're now having a reckoning on the state of casters in the system, and the Kineticist class coming out, showing that it's possible to have something that feels like a caster who doesn't have access to the spell lists and does not have to track daily resources, and people are finding fun to play, is now showing, by example, a whole new design direction for quote-unquote casters in the future. Now, before we declare that every caster from now on needs to be like the kineticist, we'll remember that there's a lot of utility that people expect in the spell lists that simply is not available to the kineticist. Think of all the spells that you would lose. And we also have to admit that a caster that can do their abilities at will all day, that there would need to be some powering down of the power of some spells. I'll just put on the screen Wall of Stone and compare it to the Earth Kineticist's 12th level feat, available at a higher level, that does less and has to be sustained. For consistency, it means losing some of the power of those spikes. For many who are not as loud right now, the Kineticist is not a replacement for being a spellcaster. It doesn't provide the feel of a caster, and doesn't give them the variety and utility that they want. However, there are many people who do want something like more narrowly focused that breaks with the tradition of spellcasters from D&D. And this poll was made on the subreddit where it was asked, do we want thematic casters? A common opinion in comments is that casters as designed by Paizo are not necessarily what some players want. A player may come in wanting a very focused build, a dedicated mentalist or necromancer, only to be faced with a selection of casters that are largely made to be big boxes of diverse tools, jacks of all trades and masters of none. And the choice, I want a thematic caster class with less versatility and more power, won out. I will share another excellent Reddit post by the same person whose post I shared earlier. I really hope Paizo explores more options to let casters specialize and be versatile toolboxes because they want to, like I do, not because they have to. Maybe with a tragically underused class archetype system, or maybe by just making full classes that are magic users but focused on a specific thing. I will point out that the removal of the traditional 8 D&D magic schools might be opening things up for Paizo to move in this direction. Mark Seifter, one of the co-designers of Pathfinder, had a recent stream, I shared this in a recent video, where he characterized the 8 magic schools as being a big green-eyed monster that demanded that all spells be something that the wizard, as the specialist in all the schools of magic, could potentially specialize in. Having 8 schools that define all of magic and then saying that the wizard has a specialist in all 8 of them not only puts a lot of pressures on the arcane list, but also prevents you from having a class called Necromancer, which is an excellent name for a class, would be probably an excellent class that you can make. And by virtue of removing the school Necromancy and then not having wizards specialize in Necromancy, now you could. So there's now more design space, arguably, with the removal of the spell schools, and with the recent brouhaha around casters in online spaces, which absolutely Paizo is reading and is aware of, we may see future classes that provide what people want, more focused concepts for casters that have a lower skill floor. I'll just point to the example of the Rogue, which to many people unfamiliar with the Swashbuckler that came out would have probably thought, oh, I could play that concept of a Swashbuckler using the Rogue class and just choosing different feats. But anyone who actually sees the Swashbuckler and what it can do will agree that it feels different in play and it's justified as being a separate class. I think there is a demand, and I think we will see from Paizo, given the recent discussions, the option to be a caster who does not hew to the traditions brought from D&D, who will exist side by side with the traditional spellcasters and not replace them. So that's it. Those are my thoughts. And subscribe and ring the bell to be notified about that upcoming live stream with my group about casters in Pathfinder 2e. They definitely wanted to do it. This would be good content to chat with this particular group. The thumbnail is casters are not weak.
Oh my gosh. No, for sure not. No.
Also, if you want to join the growing community in my Discord, definitely do so. We talk about Pathfinder 2e and other gaming. And also support the Patreon. It allows me to continue making these videos. And you also get 7-day early access to most of my videos and exclusive access to videos, including my campaign teaching Pathfinder to D&D YouTubers. So that's it. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I will see you next time.